Greetings citizens of the world, we are Anonymous. In this video we will challenge the official narrative regarding the First World War and Australia's involvement in that imperial slaughter. Anonymous believes the most respectful way of remembering the diggers is with a critical inquiry into the real history of the events, one that goes beyond the glorified fairy tale propagated by the government, that the Anzacs fought and sacrificed their lives for freedom and democracy. 300,000 Australians from a population of 5 million volunteered to fight in World War I. Over 60,000 died on the European killing fields, 8,000 in just one day in the Battle of the Somme. Over 100,000 came back physically and psychologically scarred by the horrors they experienced. Their families bore the brunt of this suffering because of government policy that refused to acknowledge the high price individuals who participated in the war to end all wars paid. World War I was essentially a trade war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. On Anzac Day this inconvenient truth will be ignored. The sacrifices made by Australian servicemen and women will be packaged and repackaged to suit the political agenda of current governments. The version of history presented for public consumption on Anzac Day has as much to do with reality as a Walt Disney cartoon. Not one moment will be set aside, not one candle will be lit. Not one monument has been built to recognize the achievements of those hundreds of thousands of Australian men and women whose personal sacrifices prevented another 60,000 Australians being sacrificed on the European killing fields for British capitalists, not for our freedom, not for our independence. Now for a short history of the anti-conscription campaign waged by workers against the Labour government. In 1915, the Labour Prime Minister Billy Hughes had begun agitating for conscription. The Dardanelles invasion had been a military disaster. The Western Front campaign was bogged down in the Flanders mud. The Universal Service League was pressing for conscription as more men were needed to die for the God, King and Country Brigade, as casualties both at the Western Front and the Dardanelles were appallingly high. In response to the pressure for more soldiers, the Billy Hughes-led Labour government conducted a war census in 1915 that found 600,000 fit men of military age in a population of a little over 5 million had not volunteered. Keen to bolster the ranks of the 300,000 young Australians who had volunteered with those who had not volunteered, the government sent each man who had not volunteered a letter which asked, "Are you prepared to enlist now? Are you prepared to enlist later on? If not, why not?" The Labour movement was in uproar at the idea of conscription. War profiteering had forced the Melbourne wharfies, the Broken Hill miners and the Illawarra coal miners to go on strike to keep their wages abreast with inflation. The Australian Socialist Movement and the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, found themselves at the forefront of a movement against conscription that included the Catholic Church led by Archbishop Mannix of Melbourne, the Labour movement and a growing women's movement. In January 1916, Billy Hughes, on his way to an Imperial War Cabinet meeting in London, sensing that support for the war was waning among Australian workers, turned his attention to the IWW trying to criminalize their activities in the eyes of their fellow workers. He denounced the Wobblies who, posing as lovers of liberty, do what they can to prevent men from joining the expeditionary forces. He stated, "It's no use treating these people like a tame cat. They must be attacked with the ferocity of a Bengal tiger." Hughes' trip to England was a disaster. The trade union movement's opposition to conscription hardened while he was overseas. Talk of a general strike was in the air. The National Trade Union Congress, which was held while he was away, only narrowly defeated the call for a national strike to end the threat of conscription. The IWW continued to curry favor among trade unionists, who began to see Australia's involvement in what was essentially a trade war as a costly mistake they wanted nothing to do with. When the Prime Minister returned to Australia at the end of July 1916, the battle on the Somme was at its height. Victory was in the balance. In response to the threat that they could lose the war, the British government introduced conscription to bolster the supply of men they could send to the European killing fields. Hughes was determined to do the same. Concerned about the possibility of a general strike if conscription was introduced and the opposition of most of the Labour movement, Cabinet refused to roll over and did not support Hughes' call to introduce conscription. Faced with determined Cabinet opposition, Hughes won a narrow Cabinet vote that called for a referendum to be called on the question of conscription. In August 1916, the Conscription Referendum Act was passed by Parliament. The scene was now set for one of the most divisive moments in Australian history. Much of the resistance to conscription came from the organised workers' movement and the women's movement. The Industrial Workers of the World, IV, Workers' Union was very active against conscription. The IV promoted the concept of one big union, and contended that all workers should be united as a social class to supplant capitalism and wage labour with industrial democracy. The Prime Minister Billy Hughes and the Premier of NSW were expelled from the Labour Party because they continued to advocate conscription. Hughes, expecting a no-confidence vote in his leadership, walked out of a caucus meeting with 23 of the 65 members present. The breakaway group formed the National Labour Party. This new party formed a temporary administration with the Conservative Nationalist opposition. 2 months later, in January 1917, the Liberals were admitted to the government. The IWW-12 went on trial for conspiracy to commit arson and sedition on the 4th of December 1916. All 12 were found guilty and were sentenced to 5 to 15 years hard labor. A Workers' Defense and Release Committee was set up to campaign to get the men out of prison. W.A. Holman, the former Labour Premier and ex-socialist who was expelled from the Labour Party for continuing to advocate conscription, won the NSW election held early in 1917 as a member of the newly formed Nationalist Party. The Nationalists won on the back of the fallout of the IWW conspiracy trials in Sydney. NSW workers, feeling the brunt of the war effort at home, went on a general strike in early August 1917, paralyzing the state. The strike was defeated when non-union workers were brought in to do the unionists' work. Billy Hughes, buoyed by Holman's election victory in NSW, concerned about a hostile Senate's ability to block the extension of the term for his government, used the public consternation caused by the NSW general strike and the jailing of the IWW as an excuse to call an early election, which his new party, the Nationalists, won handsomely. Many believed the Labour Party had blown its brains out and was a spent political force. In government with a healthy majority, the Hughes-led nationalist government pulled out all stops to punish the IWW. The IWW was declared illegal, its publications banned, its assets seized, and its members were sentenced to 6 months hard labor for belonging to a banned organization. Monty Miller, the grand old man of labor politics, a Eureka veteran and an IWW member, who had been convicted of seditions conspiracy in 1916 in WA for his anti-war activities, was sentenced at the age of 86 to 6 months hard labor. Both men and women were sentenced to the maximum term for membership of the IWW, which was now an illegal organization. Billy Hughes, buoyed by his success at crushing the IWW, announced on the day of the Bolshevik Revolution, the 17th of November 1917, that a second conscription referendum would be held in December 1917. Hughes faced open resistance from the Ryan-led Queensland Labour government. While on a whistle-stop tour in Warwick, Queensland, an egg was thrown at the PM. Senior Sergeant Kenny refused to arrest the man who had thrown the egg, telling the PM he was an officer of the Queensland government and only responsible to the Queensland government. Hughes contacted the Queensland Premier, who refused to take any further action. Hughes, furious at the rebuff, returned to federal parliament and passed legislation that created the Commonwealth Police, the forerunner of the federal police. Its time, considering the federal police's keystone cop attitude to current security issues, they adopted a federal police office climbing out of a broken egg as their official emblem. Hughes promised Australians that if the second conscription referendum failed, he would resign. The no majority was 72,476 in the first conscription referendum in 1916. The no majority had increased to 166,588 at the second referendum in 1917. Although Hughes resigned, the same ministry took office again after his farcical campaign. Considering all that, it's probably why the government encourages us to have a minute of silence during Anzac Day celebrations, because if we had an hour-long conversation as TOA wars happen, maybe we could celebrate Anzac Day different by sending the rich and political elite to go fight in many of the hellish war zones they have created through their lust for power. Many of the diggers that returned from war were disillusioned and angry, particularly the countless soldiers that returned to poverty and debt. Thousands of veterans became militant unionists and communists during the Great Depression. Yet that does not stop the ruling class speaking on behalf of the dead in order to convince the living that blind support of the state in war is the only lesson to be learned. lest we forget that throughout the First World War, the democratic will of the Australian public was against conscripting young men to die for the British Empire. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.